And so with a churlish smile, I accepted his criticisms. I was left with my thoughts as the conversation came to a close. To date, I had worn my otakudom like a badge of honor. Otaku is a Japanese word for obsessive fan. It relates to the concept of staying at home, consuming media, and building a kind of life experience through that consumption. So I'd worn my otakudom like a badge of honor, a relatively resolved doxa from which my knowledge of Pokemon could be played. Away from the 6-year-old Jude's electric scrutiny, I began to realize that I had neither the time nor the consciousness to fully apprehend all that the Pokemon universe had become in the 10 years since it was first released. Nor could I comprehend the current Pokemon game in the same way he had. Yet in what seemed like an instant, the particular style of the game had expedited our conversation to a deep level of understanding. We were two seasoned adventurers taking for granted talk of terrain, made buoyant by our shared experiences. To players of Pokemon, this immediacy is natural. The game asks of us, like Las Vegas, the same thing: to commit a certain amount of thought, to inhabit its universe in a certain way. So I want to consider some of the issues that permeate this garden conversation with my young friend, not because we achieved anything great or meaningful in our conversation, but precisely because such exchanges aren't unique. Some of what I suggest here is relevant to the broader church of Japanese games design and perhaps to the medium at large. It's become clear that committed conversations are a core part of the culture surrounding, penetrating, and issuing from the game, and I would say all Neo-Baroque texts elicit an intense conversation. There is a big conversation happening around virtually all successful new media and video games, comprising forum chatter, various kinds of fan-based creativity, complementary retailing, barroom banter, and playground chants. Pokemon is particularly characterized by a reflexive emphasis on communication, and the Japanese word sushin for communication is particularly important here because it means it assumes closeness. So it's communication that's close. Okay, and that's a really important factor in this, whereas you might think of the Neo-Baroque cinema spectacle as being distant and large. The Japanese notion of communication always assumes closeness. Okay? So, and that term is keenly promoted by spokespersons and designers at Game Freak, the people that have made this game in Japan, and it's not something that translates to America or Europe. So this ubiquity has led critics, including Koichi Iwabuchi, to question the Japaneseness of Pokemon. He argues that the ubiquity of character media like Pokemon relies on the removal of the cultural traces connected to its production source, Japan. In this odorless, culturally neutralized form, Pokemon is able to succeed commercially and internationally in a way that distinctly Japanese media cannot. So, for instance, sumo. This principle underpins the ambiguous nature of Japanese media power in the 21st century, wherein the culture evoked by the community carries only a tenuous connection to the source. Citing Hoskins and Miras, Iwabuchi writes that, quote, in contrast to the American dominance of world film markets, Japan's success derives from its exporting of culturally neutral commodities, whose country of origin has nothing to do with the way that they work and the satisfaction that the consumer obtains from usage. Hoskins and Miras contrast the ease of export of culturally neutral commodities with the much greater difficulty of exporting products that are culturally embedded. And this is just a brief overview of the contemporary Japan context. You have this notion of techno-modernity, techno-nationalism. Post-war, Japan is occupied by America, is aggressively industrialized. That industrialization makes them a major economic power, but deeply complicates Japan's sense of self. And in the substitution of a traditional long continuity sense of nationhood, you have a kind of techno-nationalism. So Japan takes ownership and pride in its aggressive industrialization and builds a sense of nationhood from that. This then is reflected in an economic boom, which has then become a recessionary shift in more recent years. And Japan's focus on the export of cultural products gives it what Douglas McRae has called gross national cool, as opposed to GDP, a kind of soft power in which its commodities are so appealing to young people and so on, that it draws substantial kind of power. It has this inflated status on the world stage. Iwabuchi suggests that these exports are odorless. They're somehow stripped of their Japaneseness to facilitate their rapid consumption around the world. While all of this is happening in Japan, the nagging problem of national identity has produced a kind of what I've called previously an Edo recuperation. Okay, so that's looking back at the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries and kind of like somehow trying to kind of draw some of those things into the modern setting. So, and contemporary Japan is defined by this contrast between traditional, classical, pre-modern Japanese culture and the postmodern cyberpunk reality of awesome broadband speed and things like that. So, in a myriad of ways, we are collectively playing with video games, but when the reciprocity between game and player is finely tuned to provide maximal capital growth, eliciting vast amounts of constituent labour from players and even some non-players, so parents that are zombified by their nagging children, we need to ask the question, what do games want from us? And this question of agency is one that I would always have about any Neo-Baroque text. How does the game form interpolate the playing subject, in the same way as the casino might interpolate its playing subject? Iwabuchi's final remarks situate Pokemon as propagating a consumerist ideology. Even if the origins of cultural products become increasingly insignificant and difficult to trace, the Japaneseness of Pokemon still does matter with regard to Japan's collusive role in generating cultural asymmetry on a global scale. Such a sober view contrasts with the prevailing optimism of suggestions that through Pokemon and other soft cultural commodities, Japan is enjoying a new international visibility, that the demand for such commodities in turn disseminates Japanese aesthetic and cultural values to an international audience. Okay, so what I'm going to do just before I carry on is talk about some concepts which I don't talk explicitly about in the paper, but relate here. So in Japan you have a concept of rikyu. Okay? Rikyu is a word in Japan which comes from the 15th century figure Senno Rikyu, who invented the tea ceremony. Okay? He worked for the shogunate of the period and advocated a kind of proto-minimalist culture where people embraced austerity and simplicity, and particularly embraced complexity of ritual, because it's in meditation on those kind of simple rituals like the tea ceremony, you had a kind of universal cultural sophistication. It was a kind of egalitarian project to connect local peasants with the elite, in the sense that they would all learn this ritual and it would somehow unify them. Rikyu in Japan is actually a word for grey, for the colour grey. Nezuromi Rikyu means rat grey. Before Senno Rikyu advocated the tea ceremony, this colour, rat grey, was associated with the peasantry, just like indigo and brown and all of those colours. When Rikyu develops the tea ceremony, it becomes so massively popular across Japan that suddenly you get this fashion for grey. And if you look in contemporary fashion by people, contemporary fashion, hokuchiyo, by people like Yoji Yamamoto, that particular kind of smoky grey is the Rikyu grey that they're adopting. Okay?